Good morning. There is a single, unique, objective, real world out there. But none of us sees it because we all see the world through our own eyes. So every one of us, when they looks at the world, is seeing something that is slightly different from what the person next to them sees. That applies even with things like geography and physics, but it applies far more so to a subject like history. That doesn't mean that there isn't a real truth, but the only way to get towards that truth is to listen to different people from different backgrounds and always be conscious that everybody who's talking to you, whether it's a lecturer, a teacher, a speaker like me, or a friend, brings to whatever they see their own personality and history. And I'm unashamed about the fact that my personality and my life history has influenced what I've chosen to talk about in the history of Britain over my lifetime. That's me. The key thing on that slide that matters isn't the picture, it's not the life history you can find elsewhere, it's the address of my website, because a great deal of what I've written and said in the past is there, actually, as well. What am I going to talk about? I want to look at a small number of areas about how much the UK has changed during the time since I was born in 1950. And then we'll have questions and answers. There'll be plenty of time for questions. Let's start with economic change, money. This graph goes a lot further back by more than 100 years since I was born. But if you look at the line for about 1950, you'll see that average income in this country was about £7,500 a year. And now it's something in the region of £25,000 a year. So it's more than tripled in the last 65 years. And this is inflation-adjusted real income. However, my personal view is that that tripling understates how much better off everybody is. And I want to give you a concrete example. And it's something that matters personally to me. I bought my first ever calculator in 1974. I've still got it. I never use it, but I keep it for sentimental reasons. It cost me £40 of 1974 money. And if you take the retail prices index and apply that today, that's the same as paying a price of £375 for that calculator. But today, nobody even buys calculators. Everybody's smartphone has a calculator function on it. But our statistics for capturing how much better off we are just don't have a good way of keeping track and allowing for that kind of adjustment in quality and technology change. And to really bring the point home, I wrote something a few years ago, which you can read on my website. Its title is Richer Than Pharaoh. And I set out to compare myself with somebody who, at that time, Ramesses II, was the richest man in the world. He was the Pharaoh of Egypt, about 1000 BC. And I won't go into the details now, but I concluded that for the things that really matter, I am actually better off than him by a mile. Education. We're in a school. Higher education participation, that's going to university basically. In 1950, 3.4%. I went to university in 1969, and by then it had gone up to about 5%. So that means that 95% of the people in this country who are the same age as me, I'm 67, did not go to university. Today, well, 2015, which is the latest figures I could get, about half of the age group goes to university. They don't all go to Cambridge. Not all universities are equally good, let's be frank about it, but there's a massive difference between going to some kind of university and leaving school in your teens and getting a manual job, for example. What that means is that there's a massive difference in education levels between young people and very old people, and that has a big impact on things like our politics, for example. Technology is something very close to my heart because I've been an early adopter. I bought my first computer in my 30s. When I was a teenager, I used to read a lot of science fiction, and I had this fantasy. When I was living in a slum in Manchester, but I had this fantasy that what I would really like, if I could have my absolute, childhood dream, would be some kind of terminal in my bedroom which would be connected to some kind of supercomputer that would have all the information in the world. It just did not exist in the 1960s, let alone trying to put a price on how much that would have cost. But basically, that's what we have right now for almost everybody who wants to have one. And another question, never mind going back to the 1960s, just go back to 1990 and ask yourself, how much would your smartphone have cost in 1990? Well, the answer is that it couldn't have been created. But if even the US government had wanted to try to create a piece of kit like that, they would have had to spend billions and billions just to make one. They couldn't do it. That is how much technology has changed in my lifetime, and that change isn't stopping. Similarly, biology. I mean, my background is much more in physics rather than biology, but I keep track of biology as well. Deoxyribonucleic acid, which everybody, of course, abbreviates to DNA, the structure was only discovered in 1953. The British, American, and other governments clubbed together and spent $3 billion over 15 years to decode one human genome. And now you can do that for $1,000. And over the last few years, we've developed technology which goes by the unpronounceable name of CRISPR-Cas9, which allows you to go into that DNA and individually edit particular genes. And we have the potential to totally eliminate certain diseases if they're linked to just one error in a piece of DNA, because you can just edit the person's DNA and get rid of it so their children won't have it. Television. Television really matters to me because if you grow up in a slum, then it's your window on the world. And what I've done here is list out the number of TV channels. I remember when a young sort of friend of mine, her parents were richer than mine, they had a TV, we didn't. I used to go around to her house to watch television. And I was really proud that by the time that we got a television, it had 2 channels, whereas hers only used to have 1. The penny didn't drop with me that her telly now also had 2 channels as well. So that was the launch of ITV back in 1955. And now, of course, we have endless numbers of channels. But the really interesting thing about this is not just the availability of channels, but what it does to society. Because I grew up at a time when basically everybody watched the same programs. Because if there are only 2 or 3 channels to watch, you can be pretty confident that most of the people, the evening before, when you're at work talking to them, watch the same television. Now, people watch very different televisions. They also don't watch by the schedule anymore because it's so easy to record programs and have catch-up programs. And there are positives to this. It means you can be much more choosy, much more selective about what you watch. There are also negatives. One of my personal bugbears is that there are now so many foreign language TV channels. You can get people who come here from overseas, from India or Pakistan, for example, and spend their entire time watching television in the language of the country they came from, and that seriously inhibits their ability to acquire English. Whereas when I was a teenager, my friend's mum, even though she couldn't speak good English, she knew enough English to watch Coronation Street because that's all there was to watch on television. Travel. I had to do a bit of looking up for this to find the figures, but in 1950, only 1 million foreign trips were taken on holiday by British people, and they, of course, were rich people. By 2016, that was 70 million. And while we joke about people going from the UK to Spain, spending their time in bars, getting drunk and coming back, the reality is that travel does change your perspective. It broadens your mind. And if I look at my own example, I came to the UK at the age of 2 in 1952. I didn't leave the country until 1981, when I was over 30, because I grew up in a very poor family. My children are globetrotters, especially my 2 daughters. My eldest daughter has been just about everywhere. And travel matters. How many people are doing Latin and recognize the word insular? Anybody? No volunteers? It's a Latin word for island. And of course, from the word for island comes the English adjective insular, which means cut off, inward-looking, separated. And in the past, Britain's attitudes were very insular, because it's amazing what a difference it makes having even 20 miles of water between us and France, whereas continental Europeans could travel around the continent far more easily than we could. With the younger generation, that is completely different. One of the things I'm particularly focused on is attitudes to the European Union and Brexit. And there's a massive gulf between the attitudes of young people who travel a lot to Europe and the attitudes of old people who grew up at a time when they were insular. If you've got somebody who's now aged in his 70s or 80s, they probably never left the UK. Ethnic diversity, again, it's obviously something that I would focus on given my own background. In 1950, England was virtually all white. You can't really even find any statistics because the census didn't used to count that kind of thing. The 2011 census for England and Wales, I've listed out the numbers, and forget about the numbers, just look at the percentages. The country is still 86% white, and there are certain parts of the country, like Macclesfield, that are much whiter than other places like central Manchester or central London. But there is a very noticeable growth in other ethnic minorities. The fastest growing ethnic category in the UK is mixed race. I've got 2 nephews who are half Pakistani origin and half Chinese origin. My son-in-law is white British, and I had a daughter-in-law, although sadly this son has got divorced, who was American Filipino. That is the way of the world. And my most recent broadcast on BBC Radio Manchester explained how humans separated as a result of evolution from the time they left Africa. Because when they left Africa, everybody looked like a black African. And the ones who went to Iceland, it helped to have a slightly paler skin, because otherwise you got rickets through lack of vitamin D, whereas the people who ended up in Central Australia, staying dark was actually a big biological advantage. With technology, simple technology like vitamin D tablets, sun cream, those things matter far less. And there's far more travel, far more intermarriage. And I've given a personal forecast, which I think is being cautious, that in less than 1,000 years, the human race will essentially look the same everywhere through intermarriage. Religious diversity, again, because of my own perspective as a Muslim, religion really matters to me. In 1950, it's hard to get hard data on what the UK was like, but it's quite clear that it was overwhelmingly Christian, mostly Church of England, but very significant other Protestant denominations like the Methodists, the Scottish Presbyterians, etc., and quite a significant Roman Catholic community. But even so, in the 1960s, in my school in Manchester, people who were Roman Catholic were felt as if they were slightly strange or different. And the only significant non-Christian minority in 1950 was Jews. Other religions were here, but they were tiny handful of Muslims. 2011 census, since 2001, so for the last two censuses, we've had an optional religious question. And here is the data for England and Wales. Christians down to 59%. Amazing growth in the number of people who say they have no religion, 25% now. 7% chose not to answer, because you're free not to answer that question. And then the other religions, Islam, at just under 5%, is clearly now the country's second largest religion. The numbers of Jews have not really changed. They've shrunk very slightly probably since the 1950s, and these various other religions. The UK is a very different religious map now than the way it was at that time. And building upon all of these things, something which I've described as the UK sense of self. What does it mean to be British? How do you feel as a British person about yourself, your country, and the rest of the world? And again, there are 60 million people in this country, and all 60 million will feel slightly differently, because we're all individuals. But I've tried to look at the big picture. This is the British Empire between the two world wars. And this is when it was at its biggest. It wasn't at its biggest in the days of Queen Victoria. It got to its biggest after the First World War, because in Africa, quite a few German colonies were taken over by the British afterwards. And at that time, 1/4 of the people of the world were in the British Empire. And it also had roughly 1/4 of the world's land area, and it is the biggest empire that's ever existed. The saying that this is the empire on which the sun never sets was literally true. Any time of the day, you could look at your watch, look at a map, and find some part of the world where it was daylight, which was part of the British Empire. Because there were lots of islands in the Pacific, for example, as well. 2018, the UK is still an important country. We have nuclear weapons, we're a permanent member of the UN Security Council, and we have massive soft power. Soft power means that other people care about your culture, they want to visit you, they're influenced by you, they read your newspapers, they pay attention to what you say, rather than being coerced because you've got more guns or a bigger economy. But in terms of absolute GDP, we're now only the world's 5th largest economy, and we're about to sink to 6th because India is about to overtake us. 21 in terms of population ranking, and with every year that goes by, to a greater and greater extent, other countries matter more in the world than the UK does. That's just brutal reality, because when you're a small country of 60 million people, compare that with the scale of China, there's just no comparison. However, let's step back. Compared to 1950, when, even at that time, Britain wasn't top dog anymore, America was top dog. But no matter how far back you want to go, if you go back to the height of the British Empire in the 1800s, when Britain really did rule the world, and look at the lives of British people at that time, compared to looking back, we are far better educated, we know the world far better, we're richer, we're healthier, we're longer lived, and we're much more diverse, because Britain is becoming like the rest of the world. So that is my quick run through about how this country has changed in my lifetime. I'm happy to answer questions on anything to do with what I've said.